The last few One Piece chapters have been nothing short of incredible. It's not a stretch to say that in just 4 chapters of backstory, the entire One Piece world has changed immeasurably. Especially after this recent chapter 1159, and likely after the next few chapters as well, the One Piece world will continue to shift and nothing will ever be the same. And if you have to pinpoint one reason for all of this shifting, it is all because of this rivalry at the peak of the One Piece world, Roger versus Rocks. These two have changed the One Piece world forever, and after God Valley, there is no going back. I really do believe God Valley marks the end of an era in One Piece and the beginning of another one, and I want to talk about how Oda is using this incident as well as this peak rivalry, Rocks versus Roger, as the catalyst of this incident to propel the One Piece world into this new era. There is a ridiculous amount of discussion and analysis you can pull from both these characters as well as the entire God Valley incident, and we haven't even got the whole incident yet. So if you want to keep up as things begin to change in the One Piece manga, make sure to subscribe, and let's get into it. Oda is going to use this flashback and the rest of the God Valley incident to show us the switching of eras in the One Piece world and how Rocks and Roger really did formulate the current One Piece environment we're acting in right now. However, he's already been using this flashback to show us the previous era before God Valley. So before we understand how Oda is going to change the One Piece world with this incident, let's talk about what he's deliberately showing us in the old era of One Piece. I think if you ask current One Piece manga readers what the biggest shock about the old era of One Piece is, as we've seen in this flashback, they will probably all answer how shocking it is that all the major players in the pirate world are kind of friends with one another. Almost every big-time pirate introduced in this flashback have kind of had friendly interactions with one another. The Kuja pirates, the Rocks pirates, the Roger pirates, and even the Giant Warrior pirates before Harold kind of submitted himself to the world government are all seen intermingling with each other in sort of friendly ways. We see the Roger pirates and the Rocks pirates at Shaki's bar on Pirate Island, Rocks' literal hideout. We see Roger and the Kuja pirates mingle on each other's boats and have no really explosive interactions that causes any incidents. And even someone as powerful and formidable as Rocks is able to leisurely stroll onto Elbaf and demand an audience with Harold, who at the time was still a very big-time pirate, and absolutely nothing happens here. They just have a chat. Again, things with Harold would change once he decided to bend the knee to the world government, and that is an entire different story, but up until this point, it's very clear that Oda is making it extremely obvious for the readers that this era of piracy is completely different from the current era of the One Piece story. Us readers are very acclimated to insane tensions amongst pirates in the One Piece world. Almost every interaction of pirates in today's One Piece is cutthroat battles and negotiations, rivalries, and a lot of fighting. Even if Blackbeard had nothing to do with the death of Ace, I think if Blackbeard and Luffy at their current levels of notoriety were to sit down at a bar together, it wouldn't end well. Oda's making it extremely clear that the old era of One Piece had something that the current era of One Piece doesn't, and that's exactly what he wants to get across with this backstory. I think the number one reason for this, something that's going to change after God Valley, is the existence of the One Piece. The current era of One Piece is so cutthroat because all the pirates in the Grand Line are after the same treasure. By default, all of the pirates active in the present story are rivals because they're all aiming for the same thing. There is a literal structure to the One Piece world that allows these pirates to fight each other and have these default rivalries because of the existence of such a magnificent treasure, and that's just how the One Piece world currently works. Compared to the old era of One Piece that we're seeing now in this flashback, it's quite obvious that nobody was after this grand treasure, and there weren't any rivalries unless people were after the same thing. People were free to pursue their dreams, didn't have to worry about fighting over the same goal, and even if they would fight over the same goal, like Shaki for example, there wasn't any bad blood, and there was a lot of just normal, stereotypical pirate activity going on. When you think of just normal pirates in the real world, your stereotypical image of a pirate, it's extremely like that type of character to just go after the most beautiful woman they find, and because this era was so laid back and not everybody was gunning for the One Piece, we have literal normal pirates just doing pirate things, all hunting after the girl they like. This is exactly what allows people like Roger and Rocks to get along. Although they do not seem to be friends, to be able to sit at the same bar and not fight at the Rocks headquarters is definitely telling of the era, and I think it's because, although they were both after Shaki, their true ambitions were different and they weren't actually clashing heads. That is, until God Valley. How did the One Piece world go from this lackadaisical, happy-go-lucky place to now this cutthroat era of people hunting for the One Piece? Well, yes, you can attribute that to Roger's execution and him telling people that the One Piece exists. If you really dig down into it, it actually started at God Valley, the very incident that created the current structure of the One Piece world all the way down to its roots, and it all comes down to the actions of Roger and Rox on this island. Oda has gone out of his way to show us how different the old era of One Piece is, because he's about to show us, with the God Valley incident, how that all changed, and how the current era of One Piece was actually born. Which brings us to the God Valley incident, where the actions of Roger and Rox, the greatest rivalry in One Piece, would create the next era of the One Piece world. But before we look at that rivalry, you can just look at the amount of people relevant to the story that were present on God Valley, and it becomes obvious that Oda was trying to create the new era of One Piece just with the inclusion of characters in this incident. To me, the juiciest example of this is the inclusion of Dragon as a young Marine soldier at God Valley. Although Dragon really hasn't done anything in the main story yet, so he's still a very mysterious figure, it is clear to me that the current era of One Piece, the era that's a little bit older than Luffy's new era, is headed by this mysterious figure Dragon, who's not only the oldest out of this generation, but seems to be pushing the tide of fate against the world government and really ushering in a new generation of people. And I think Oda's inclusion of Dragon at God Valley spells exactly that. What Dragon is currently doing in the One Piece world, gradually moving all of these important players against the world government in the shadows, is almost exactly what he did at God Valley, going against his orders as a Marine, and likely being the reason why such major players in the current era of One Piece, Shanks and Blackbeard, made it off of the island. We see in the end of this chapter, Dragon finds Garling's wife with Shanks and Shamrock, and is probably the reason why Shanks made it onto Roger's ship in the first place, which is the reason why One Piece is happening in the first place, and could also be the reason why Blackbeard got off of this island, which right there is two extremely formidable players in the current era of One Piece, Shanks and Blackbeard, saved by Dragon, somebody who literally created the new era of characters with his actions on God Valley. Not only that, the father of every current Yonko would be present on God Valley. Luffy and Dragon, Shanks and Garling, Blackbeard and Rox, and of course it's a very popular theory that Buggy is also the son of Rox. While Buggy could fit into this in a different way, whether he's part of the Davy clan, which is something mentioned in chapter 1159 that we're going to get into later in this video, or if Rox had another child in secret, or just wasn't aware of having another child, these are all possibilities. Regardless, it's clear that the fathers of a lot of the Yonko of the current generation were present on God Valley. But honestly, that doesn't even begin to cover the entire list of important characters who were at this incident. Of course, we know Garp played a major role. It's very likely that Emu made an appearance here. Of course, the rest of the Roger pilots, like Rayleigh and Scopper Gaban, are extremely important in the current story. We haven't even begun to talk about Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom. The three Yonko who shaped the current era of One Piece were present on this island. So just looking at the amount of important players present at this incident makes it obvious that Oda is creating this incident to be this kind of switching of the eras, this imperative moment for the One Piece story, the creation of the structure of the One Piece world as we know it today. But this switching of the eras is defined by the inherited will of a certain person, and that inherited will exists in two people on this island. Of course, I'm talking about the rivalry, Roger and Rox. This rivalry defines this insane incident, and these two characters stand out amongst all the important players in this incident, and let me explain to you why their existence as a rivalry defines the current world of One Piece and will define the end of the story as well. It all starts with Rox's conversation with Harold in this chapter. There's a grand reveal that Rox D. Zebek is actually a cover name for Rox's true name, Davy D. Zebek. And of course, this also means one of the reasons why the world government raided God Valley, apart from the resources it had, was because they discovered the Davy clan's lineage on this island, the first time they've been found in 800 years, meaning they were part of that ancient Buccaneer civilization that the world government wants to wipe out, and this was their chance to finish the job. For the longest time, people proposed the idea that Rox and then Blackbeard were the evil version of the Will of D, enemies of Joy Boy, and perhaps even on the side of the world government in a way. However, with the reveal of Rox possessing the name Davy, and also the world government's intention to wipe out the name Davy, it sort of gives us the idea that even though Blackbeard is sort of this villainous character, the name Davy is still destined to go against the world government, and definitely still follows the will of Joy Boy. Now, something that's extremely important here that I think this chapter made even more possible is something I mentioned in this video linked here. Don't worry, you don't have to watch it for this video to make sense, but the summary of it is that Davy Jones and Joy Boy are the exact same person. Davy Jones is his real name, and that the Will of D sort of separated into two different ideals. Why is that important at all, or what am I getting at here? Well, you may have put it together already, but if Rox possesses the name Davy, that means he is the direct continuation of Joy Boy's bloodline, and is an ancestor of the first pirate, Davy Jones or Joy Boy. What gives this theory a little bit more evidence is that it now makes sense why Garling said the Great One would be pleased when he was proposing the God Valley hunt to the Gorosei. Garling was proposing this fight, we now know, because he found remnants of the Davy clan on this island, and if Emu of all people would be pleased that the Davy clan was going to be hunted down, it's obvious that the Davy clan was enemies of the world government, or Emu specifically, which we know is definitely Joy Boy. Now stay with me here, but we're going one level deeper. When you think about it, that means this rivalry that created the current One Piece world was the ancestor of Joy Boy, the one possessing his bloodline, versus his spiritual inheritor, Roger, the man with the straw hat. The straw hat means everything here. We've seen the giant straw hat that Emu possesses that almost certainly belonged to Joy Boy, so that means this fateful island, this incident that shaped the One Piece world, centered around this rivalry and this battle between Rox and Roger, was a fight between Joy Boy's inheritor and Joy Boy's direct ancestor, Roger and Rox. The Will of D is destined to take on the government and liberate the world. That is something that has remained constant in the entirety of One Piece, and at this island where the entire world government was present, we had two candidates of this will, Roger and Rox, fight each other in the presence of their main enemy, creating the next One Piece world. And while it's unclear why Roger and Rox would even fight at this island, because at this point in time it feels like they would have a common enemy against the world government, the reality is it's very likely that the world government saw these two candidates of the Will of D go at it, realized that the ancient enemies of the gods, the Will of D, still persisted in these two characters, and would begin to vastly change the One Piece world, creating that cutthroat environment that exists today. Roger would likely see the events that went on at God Valley, go on to even further defy the world government, go to Lodestar Island, discover the existence of the poneglyphs, redo his journey, and find the One Piece, all because his grand rival Rox, the one he was fighting over Shaki with, the other pirate who defined the era along with him, fell at God Valley to the hands of the world government, leaving just Roger in his wake. With the way their relationship has been going, and the introduction of Domi Reversi in Elbaf, I think it's actually entirely possible that Rox was being controlled by Emu towards the end of this incident. Considering as it is now, I find it hard to believe that Roger and Rox would go at it in such an insane way when the world government was present on this island in the first place. Meaning that what Sengoku told us about Garp and Roger taking out Rox was actually some kind of rewritten history, which would make sense with the world government. But also that Roger having to slay his rival, who was being controlled by the world government, would go on and spur him to create this new era and usher on all of these pirates to go find the One Piece, because he knew someone would have to liberate the world from that oppressive force. The one he found on God Valley was orchestrating the strings of the world he was living in. And of course, on the opposite side, the world government would have the exact same motivations after realizing pirates as strong as Roger and Rox almost made it to the peak of the world with their rivalry, so they would begin to crack down on pirates on an even crazier level, which again we see now in the current world where Emu is trying to coerce the giants to join the world government to prepare for this final war that's meant to wipe out all of the opposing forces to the world government. This also has massive implications on Luffy and Blackbeard, because it means the fight between Luffy and Blackbeard will also be a fight between the inheritor of Joy Boy's will, as well as the literal bloodline of Joy Boy in Blackbeard. If the God Valley incident was the turning point of the world, where the Will of D, in Rox and Roger, got as close as it ever was to overthrowing the world government, both in proximity and in power, then the exact same thing is going to happen when Luffy and Blackbeard fight. The two frontrunners of the current generation who will be at the forefront of the fight against the world government in the end of the story mirror Rox and Roger as the inheritor of Joy Boy's will and the bloodline of Joy Boy. And in the same way that those two things faced off against Emu and the world government at God Valley, they will face off against Emu and the world government at the end of the story, this time coming out victorious with Luffy on top. Although we don't know the specifics of what happened during the God Valley incident, and we can only speculate about the battle between Roger and Rox, it is clear that Oda is using this backstory to show us and establish that the old generation was a lot more laid back and less cutthroat compared to the current era of One Piece, where everyone is gunning after the same treasure and the world government's level of oppression has been cranked up to its max level, and the catalyst, the trigger that switched these two eras and caused the current day of One Piece is the God Valley incident. Whatever happened between Roger and Rox, two inheritors of Joy Boy's will in two different ways, and after the conclusion of this incident, there would be no going back. Every character present, which happened to be all the important players of the current era of One Piece, would change forever, and the One Piece world would never be the same. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, I'd super appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Again, the God Valley flashback is finally here. It's unfolding in front of our eyes, and it will continue to unfold for probably the next few chapters. So if you want to keep up with my analysis and my predictions and my reactions to all these events, again, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you on the channel. Thank you for watching, and until next time.